All right, what are we talking about today?
Well, I've had the flu for a week.
That sucks.
Yeah, we could talk about that.
We could
Still
talk about
fighting.
that.
Um, I don't know. We've had a lot of conversation in the last 2 days. We talked a lot about conflict in um, faith communities, Brave City communities. We've talked a lot about
Conflict.
the incredible importance of prayer, of being like a community of prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've been thinking, probably because you being here, I've been thinking a lot of Bill and James, of these men that have been living in interconnected faith community for what, 40, 50 years now.
Since the 60s.
So
That could be a really cool story to explore. Um,
yeah, just like I've just been thinking about their way of life.
Mhm.
And
well, I imagine that could also, I don't know, you know the story, but if we navigate that story, that could probably take us through a little bit of conflict. Prayer and conflict will probably be, if
Yeah.
we almost like think of that as a lens through which we're gonna approach that.
well, I can say something to kind of open the door, and then we'll just see where it takes us.
Yep. All right.
You on record?
We're
Yeah,
recording. I'm just gonna have to cut all this off in the front, but we can just pause and then do whatever.
Hey, Happy New Year, 2025 from the Brave Cities team. It is day one of 2025. The reason we jumped on today, which is not our normal podcast day, is because we got our friend Joel Repic in town. He and the whole fam decided to come over and down,
Straight shot.
and just spend a little time with us. And I think our kids stayed up till
2 a.m.
2 or 3 a.m. last night.
Perfect.
We went to bed around.
I was at
8:40,
8:45.
Yeah, we were in bed at 10, but the kids, they went hard all night.
One benefit of living kind of 10 minutes out on a farm, we don't have any of that crazy stuff that will keep us up. Like it actually is quiet. How was Central Avenue last night?
It was fine.
Really?
A lot of gunshots, but normal, good music to the ears, good rhythm to sleep to.
Standard gunshots on Central?
Shotguns are kind of like,
Really, they're going shotguns now?
mhm,
For the new year, right?
mhm.
That happens in my community too.
Yeah,
Man.
yeah.
Oh,
The shotguns are more like a kind of like a kick drum, and then the pistols are more like a hi-hat or a, and if it stays on rhythm, it's easy to
so
sleep
no,
to.
no sirens though? Like,
Oh yeah, sirens. That's just the melody in the background.
do we know any death count for the evening?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't know that there were any deaths at all, but I just think
Celebratory shots.
We
Yeah,
won't know till tomorrow because
there
usually
was
Alton
shenanigans.
media takes the day off today too, so we'll probably hear tomorrow.
But if you guys know Joel, you know that he lives in a pretty special community just outside of Pittsburgh in Aliquippa. And I'll let anything he wants to share about Aliquippa, he can. We've been there many times, all of us. But the unique thing, and I guess the thing that I've been thinking about as we've sat around talking the past few days are these men and women that moved into Aliquippa in the 70s,
80s.
80s, from all over the world, England, Ireland, right? Just
Yeah, well, their community had been in Scotland. I can just tell
Yeah.
some story of that. Yeah.
and they've been living together in close proximity and kind of shared lifestyle and shared commitment to the poor and to a certain way of using and spending, and a certain way of organizing their life. And I've been around them, And for some reason, Bill and James come to mind. We can talk about anyone, but their level of contentment, I think, is what I'm really drawn to. I think in the kingdom pursuit, contentment might be close to the core of like what we are all after, is just this posture and position of satisfaction, of like, we know Jesus and we know his kingdom, and we're content with it, and we're content in telling others about it. And which seems to be in such a massive contrast to everything we see around us in the world, of this like constant chasing something new, constantly chasing better, bigger. So I just want to talk about them. I want to talk about their commitment to prayer. I want to talk about their commitment to working through conflict, authenticity, all those things. So yeah, man, we're glad you're here, and we think you might be on with us a little bit more often in 2025. And so tell us a little bit about your life and their life, really.
Yeah.
Kind of testify vicariously.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I've shared before, we live in this low-income community outside of Pittsburgh. But a really special part of our story is that right when we moved in, we discovered this Benedictine religious order of the Episcopal Church. Their story was that there was a renewal in Houston, Texas, actually, in the 60s. It was part of the Jesus People movement. And they started really just trying to radically live out the Sermon on the Mount. So back in those years, they were creating these households that included several families that could support then people who were homeless or had mental health issues, bringing them into their homes, or just lonely or in a tough spot in life. Or eventually they moved to Scotland. A couple hundred of them, I think, moved to Scotland, inhabited a monastery there, did some work with the Church of England, and then felt they were really feeling a call back to their roots, which for them was inner city America. They had been in an inner city neighborhood in Houston previously. So moved back to Aliquippa in the 80s. Went through some hard things.
Were you familiar with Aliquippa before then?
No, in the Episcopal Church, they have a bishop. The bishop invited them, that he knew what kind of community they were looking, to live into. So our steel mill had just shut down. And so I think they moved in the year following. Anyway, pretty special group. I mean, they live out this Benedictine way, which I can explain more of what that is, how it's impacted
do that
us.
real quick.
Yeah.
There are hundreds of new listeners who don't know what Benedictine
Well,
is.
I wouldn't without these folks. I mean, it's not like that was in my tradition, but yeah, it's interesting. I think these monastic communities, which are apostolic communities, I think they're missionary communities, lives of radical missionaries living together.
Sometimes you view monastic as the opposite. You think
Right.
that they're kind of like taking a chill,
Right.
gonna leave the world and just go do that.
That's right. But I think that's a misconception. I think maybe it's become that, and sometimes over the years. Yeah. Sure. But I think historically these were the missionary communities of radical discipleship, in the life of the church. So it's interesting. I always say, like, I feel like these different communities, Franciscans, Benedictines, you may hear these names. It's almost like they steward a certain angled view of Jesus. It's like somewhere along the line, in this case, Benedict, who was alive during the fall of the Roman Empire and the decline of the Roman Empire and all of that, saw Jesus in a certain way, formed community around that, and it has a certain emphasis. So for Benedictines, that emphasis comes around a few things. Prayer is one, commitment to the poor, work is a big one. So Benedictines historically are pretty entrepreneurial. creating businesses, and they just work hard and believe in meaningful work to the end of their life, which is one
Yeah,
of the things.
not in the sense that our current culture we
That's
think
right.
of entrepreneurial, like this cutthroat, get money,
That's right.
get paid, but they just create good things.
Out of joy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But work is prayer, prayer is work.
Yeah.
And then there's also a notion of stability. So it's interesting, like the Franciscans, if you know anything about them, you might not, they really have this emphasis on going, on not getting tied down by possessions in a way, so that they can always go to the next place. And that is, I think that's like part of what it looks like to be a missionary.
Right.
Benedictines kind of have a different emphasis, and it's
Place.
it's stability, it's lifetime commitment or long chunks of commitment to a certain plot of the earth. Typically in the wilderness, which can mean out in the middle of nowhere, but more the point is, though, on the edges of empire.
Right.
So that's why a community like this would want to live in a place like Aliquippa, because it's on the edges of empire. So
and in response to what they don't like about empire in that spot, right? I mean,
that's right. Yeah, it's a prophetic witness. Yeah.
Some issue of, I always heard that most monastic movements, they're shooting for some type of purity. So like you said, these guys were more about the Sermon on the Mount, like let's be pure to that.
Let's live it out.
But it seems like it's also always under the struggle of empire.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I think as I've gotten to know these folks, I think one of the most courageous things they've done is they've identified, and I think this is why I was drawn to them in my 20s. I think they've identified the few virtuous desires, prayer, the poor, that they really want to be at the center of their life. Then they've had the courage to actually live their life around those things instead of according to the narrative of empire. I think it takes courage, because I think if you live around those few virtuous desires and really attempt to live that kind of life, which is why I think they're so content, by the way, because that's what they've done. But if you do that, it takes courage, because you're always going to feel empire pulling against it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So the story of them acquiring the apartment complex.
Yeah.
Was that specifically because they went presents, let's find it, or did that just come
That's
up
right.
from some weird random?
And they really believed in living in proximity with each other and having a presence in a particular community. So eventually they purchased these 12 row houses. I currently live in one of those. And some other houses actually too, kind of right around there, fixed up those houses. And now they have some other spaces too, a chapel for prayer, some other things, but they've really revitalized a whole block of the city pretty much, and lived in that space. Yeah. Live out of a common purse. That's a really radical thing for them. So all these years, they've always shared vehicles, they might work even outside of the community, and they might have a paycheck from somewhere, but it goes into the common purse, and then
they get like allowances, because
yeah,
housing was probably covered from the purse, right? So they never had to write checks.
That's right.
So what would they have needed
Yeah.
for? Like
so one thing I should mention too, I think when we think of like these monastic kind of communities, we tend to think of celibate communities. In the Jesus people movement times, something else started to develop where families could join these kinds of things, and single people as well. So that's how their community always was. It included families as well as single people. And yeah,
way better option.
What's that?
I think way better option.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
60 after all.
Right. And so yeah, they had a way of distributing to the families based on need. However, they've all chosen to basically live at a level of poverty. So it's really interesting. The older members that are still present there, they actually don't pull from the common purse anymore, because Social Security and all of that is enough for their standard of
life. How would that work? Like if we're in there together, you decide you want your kids to play hockey, it's $10K a year.
Yeah.
And where you want the really high-end Nintendo set and the other family started going with time out. How did that roll?
I think that would be a great conversation to have with them. But you're hitting on something, and it's that I think Empire makes us feel like these forms of radical discipleship are just implausible, like it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And it is hard, but what I've appreciated about having them so near to us as friends is that that's like an example of a great question I've asked them over the years. It's like, wait, if we're following the Sermon on the Mount, that feels okay when you're like 21 and you know what I mean? Like trying to live right. But then as you're trying to live the totality of your life this way, and you have kids, and
That's the conflict of community.
that's right. And they've just been great mentors and guides to us on all of these things. To be clear, I feel like they still are more radical than I've been, or our community has been.
Well, what's interesting is we all make these choices, though. I find this to always apply in the moment of a crossroads in these conversations, because apply it like this. I'm young, I'm adventurous, I want to travel the world, but I fall in love with a girl. And let's say that marriage is not a common practice in my culture. And so I tell people, I think I want to like covenant to this woman and I want to have children with her. Well, the question then is, okay, that sounds good, but what are you going to do when you have a new baby and you want to pick up and go to Bali? You don't. You change.
Saying yes to some things always means saying no to other things. Yeah.
But when we do start talking about anything in regard to covenant community, it does seem like most of the time it takes one or two conflicting questions for most people to go, oh, cool, I'm out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, you made that sacrifice to have a family.
Mm-hmm.
You made that sacrifice to get married. We're just saying that maybe guys like Bill and James discovered something in this way of life. And it's always to be evolved upon. It's always to be improved upon.
Discerned through.
Culture and life is a lot different than it was in the 70s and 80s. So you guys are now experimenting with new things, new ways of life, new ways of living. There's also callings that move some people outside of the community, right, where they have to either move or leave or do something different. I think what's so appealing about it to me is simply the posture of we're together.
Yeah.
We're working together. Like our testimony is not, this is kind of where I want to pass it. So somebody jump in. Our testimony is not that we changed Aliquippa. Our testimony is not that we saw from 1980 to 2025 over 70,000 people come to Christ. Our testimony is not that we built 40 to 60 world-class ministries. Our testimony is that we stayed together and that we were unified under the banner of Jesus. And we just said, we're going to keep figuring it out, but we're going to stay for one another.
Yeah.
Would they agree to that sentiment?
They talk a lot about just faithful presence, as a kind of witness, just like we're here, God's among us.
And again, that doesn't mean that some people might not live there right now.
That's right.
There's probably periods of time.
Oh, they've been through some hard things, for sure. I mean, there's just the natural thing, people move away or whatever.
Yeah.
But they've also been through some really hard times where there was maybe an exodus or, those kinds of things. And yet there's been a testimony.
Did they come in with the covenants when they came into Aliquippa, or did they grow into the covenants as they went? Oh, I think.
Well, they definitely grew into it. It's just that it happened some of that happened prior to Aliquippa. So this is another thing we've really learned from them, just in the flow, the history of what happened with them. They would say Houston, I think what they would say is that Houston were kind of their years of revival. There was a move of the Spirit. They were embracing the poor. And it was kind of,
That was in the 70s.
yeah, and it was the 60s and 70s. And it was kind of wild, you know, it was like when they got to Scotland, they started to embrace a way of life, a rule of life. And I think it allowed them to still embrace the spontaneous move of the Spirit in their midst, but also to settle into a way of living rhythms that have changed over the years. So they've all, you know, now they've prayed in Aliquippa, they've prayed 3 times a day on that property for almost 40 years. You know, the offices,
Right.
they use the Book of Common Prayer and all that. But they always encourage us, like they grew into that, you know. So they talk about how, for instance, when they decided they wanted to start adding evening prayer, which they do at 5:30, they still had families, they still had kids. So you're talking about sports and stuff.
Yeah.
It was a big issue in their community. It was like, how do we incorporate evening prayer? We want this, but we have kids, we have dinner, we have sports. Most of their kids went to the public school. So it's like, how do we do that? And they talk about how they had to grow into that together, you know, and they've encouraged us. I think this is key. I want to say something about the Common Purse as an example of this. They've really encouraged us not to just copy them, you know, because that's shortcutting a process, you know. And one thing I don't know if I mentioned yet, just to tie up a loose end here, maybe our community is now in the process of inheriting their property, legacy, all of that. But even as we've done that, and I think really a Benedictine ethos, you know, even as we've done that, they've encouraged us not just to copy them, you know, but to allow the Spirit to do something. So for instance, the Common Purse. We haven't lived out the Common Purse like that.
Yeah.
In the community that we're in. However, I could point to ways that we've wrestled with that notion
and practiced it.
Yeah, how we've shared homes and vehicles and how I do think it's made us less dependent on empire for our way of life, right? But it hasn't looked like
it's evolved.
Yeah, what it looked, and it's still evolving. I think we want to keep leaning into that more, you know. How do we have, what does it mean to have all things in common? You know, for us, they had an answer to that for what it looked like for them over time, but we're learning what that looks like for us.
So like for people listening on the Big Cities thing, I think in the book we do talk a little bit about covenant. We bring up the idea of covenant community. We've had some people go, hey, could you send us your covenants? Like and we've never developed them. Because we also came into Alton, we didn't come in with a covenant. We weren't even sure what we were going to do in this town. So things evolved. But I would say that when I think about our people, like the family, I think they would probably all agree on that. We kind of do share stuff. You know, I got a new log splitter. So I texted Taylor because I know they had no heat in their house for a while. So they were burning wood. It was like, we got another tool in the community. So I think most people in our community would go, no, you don't have to worry about asking somebody for something. We tend to have, I wouldn't say we have nothing close to a common purse, but we've had this common project where a lot of people have been employed, and they all know that we navigate the finances, the economy in such a way that we're always thinking about what everybody's doing, if we can help somebody start something. But we don't have clear covenants. And I think at this point it would almost be weird to come up. But I think a lot of people listening, as they go into cities, they should consider this. Sometimes if people go, well, what is this thing you're doing in Alton? Sometimes I've said we're like a neo-Trappist order when they say, well, why neo? I go, well, because we don't have this clear covenant.
Yeah.
But we definitely, outside of the halters that moved out of town, I think everybody lives within 2 miles here. So there's been this weird, we're Alton. We're not for the whole big area. So that's been a weird intuitive covenant. But I think if people are going, well, we want to start from scratch, we want people to consider people that have lived intentional covenant community as
Yeah.
you, because it might help you as you kind of move forward.
Yeah, I think a big part of our story with our friends um has just been watching them, you know? Like I think we're 20 years in our community now. They're decades into living in an intentional community. They've lived in Aliquippa since the 80s.
Mhm.
But more and more at this point, we realize just how much they've affected us.
Mhm.
Not by sitting us in a room and telling us this is how you do it. We've just observed their intentionality, their way of life, their way of prayer. And now there's no going back. Like they've they've just rubbed off on us,
Yeah.
There's no changing that now.
The there is a there's a mysterious sacredness though to these spiritual practices,
Mm.
because I'd like for you to, John, maybe compare it a little bit to you guys' first 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, I was wanting to.
Mm.
I definitely have some thoughts here. I was just thinking about that. And but do you want me to do that now or you got more
Well,
to
and
say?
I was gonna do the same. So we were, Lindsay and I were, we'll just go 12 years strong in Birmingham of developing and forming and I guess kind of establishing a community that is in this stream. And had we known the celebration guys and had we known you guys, just like with Tampa, we would have felt an extreme camaraderie. And we found a common life in our work by starting small businesses. We found a common life in living in really close proximity. We called it living within sock distance or within baby monitor distance. We knew early on. I mean, we had really young kids when we first moved. My oldest two were babies, and we knew that we needed to be together in the evenings to pray, to like reflect, to ask questions of how everyone's doing. And so we knew that if we could live to where we could hear each other's baby monitors, we could have that type of rhythm together. But we also wanted to work together, and so we would constantly have these ideas of where we were living and what needs arose in the communities we were in, and we would start those businesses and we would start different types of experiences or ministries, like things like sports, athletics. We started a gym because a lot of us were into physical fitness. And so we just wanted to be together in these spaces. And the reason we didn't join other gyms, we did at times, but we constantly found that empire ruled over these spaces. The poor were not welcome in the gyms that we were in,
Yeah.
both financially, especially if it was anything like high level training, like CrossFit, something like that. They could never afford something like that. And then
That's
number
true.
two, just in general, there wasn't like a spirit of welcome of men and women that didn't carry themselves or smell or communicate or look a certain way. So it wasn't a separatist
Right.
posture, but it was a protest.
Yeah.
It was like, if you're not going to welcome our friends, we're going to start environments that tell our friends you're welcome here. And that just created a way of life. But this is what I wanted to say, John, and then you got it, is had we not had a deep commitment to the spiritual practices, we would have just wound up being a neighborhood association. We would have just wound up being a collective of kind of innovative thinkers that had no real purpose other than doing something cool in the city. And I see a lot of that too, of people who really do like to do cool things in their city and like help people. But Jesus has slowly been omitted, and dependence or interdependence on him together has slowly been omitted from their practices. And I don't really think that's a valuable pursuit. So I found that to be a very common theme in our community and what I saw in you guys. And then we connected to Tampa early on, probably 2012 or 13-ish, I think, is when I met John and a guy named Brian Sanders, who's been on the podcast, a guy named Jeremy Stevens, Stacy Gaskins. And they were living a really similar way of life with very similar commitments and covenants. So compare it to some of y'all, John.
Okay, so a couple things that have been said. When you were talking about so first of all, so we had a community of men for the most part. We did have some women there, in particular Mama, who was like an older woman that lived on the streets that we ended up having move in. She kind of became our house mom, which was incredible. But there's a bunch of us living in this house in a like between two housing projects here in Tampa. There's about, on average, it'd be about 12 of us at any given time. And so we all moved in together and we tried to be really intentional. We were really inspired. I mean, honestly, we used Benedictine values and the rule even to inspire a lot of what we were doing. But I would say the primary inspiration for us originally was actually the Catholic worker, and the idea of houses of hospitality for the poor. And so and then also Franciscan spirituality. So we were like pulling from these traditions and remixing, right? So we weren't like putting a stake in the ground on any of these traditions. We were just going, I don't know, we're going to move in together and try to figure out how to follow Jesus. Much like you said, that group in the 60s and 70s go, I don't know, let's try to live out the Sermon on the Mount, right? So what does it actually look like to love our neighbor? And so we did actually develop together something like, Hugh mentioned, like someone's like, hey, do you have like a covenant? We developed over time, probably our first year, because we had a meeting once a week. We'd all get together, just the people who lived there. And then we had another night we all got together with people who didn't live with us for a community dinner and had people come in. But this one that was more exclusive to the crew there, we developed what we called the Declaration of Interdependence, which was like our rule, so to speak. And it was broad brushstroke stuff. It was like, we're like, I just pulled this up. Like it was a commitment to community and sharing, to the neighborhood, to hospitality. So like a commitment, like the door is open. So this house is built around hospitality, particularly to the poor, but sharing and giving, and then how we were cooking for neighbors and for one another. And then around like lifestyle, there was like, we knew, like, we were really inspired by, like, you talked about the like Franciscan, like vow of poverty almost. And we were like, well, we probably can't swing that. I mean, but we made what we called like a voluntary simplicity was like etched in, like that was something that and it wasn't like chiseled in stone of what it meant, but it was like among those things. And then there's a handful of other things for us that we committed to. But the common purse thing stood out to me. So what we did was we had what we called a common purse, but it wasn't technically. So we each had our own life and bank account. And I mean, we were young. And so it was like, that's not practical or possible for us at that point, especially early on in the formation of the community. But we did have shared bills, right? So you got like the rent, there's things like that. So we added all those up. Like, well, we're obviously going to pool the resources for those things. And then groceries, and then, like we shared vehicles. So car maintenance, things like that. Like there were some things so we made a budget together. But then we said, we want to be able to do stuff for our neighbors and in the community. And we were developing that house into like an urban homestead. So we were growing as much food as we can. That was a big part of one of our commitments around. So creativity was the commitment, but creation was a big part of that. So it was like cultivating food and living by some convictions around like food systems. And so we were growing food. And so we're like, well, we definitely are all going to have chores, but we all need to have like money too, to like go, hey, we want to build a solar hot water heater so we can get off, electricity with the water heater or whatever. So we did that. But like who's going to pay for it? So we started pooling money for projects and pooling money for outreach. What we ended up doing then with that budget is then we just inflated it. We're like, okay, like here's what it is for us to live like this, which by the way was quite low when you're all living in one small house. You can live on a few $100 a month. So well, how much can we do? And so we came up with a much larger number that we would pool. So you pay that as dues. And out of that then house fund, which was the common purse, all the bills were paid, all the things were paid. And one of the community members kind of kept the books on that and would report at each meeting. But then if we were doing a house project or our neighbor needed like their roof fixed, like it would come out of that fund. So it didn't come out of any in particular person's like bank account because we had previously committed it. Anyway, I thought of that as you were talking about moving into like, how do we experiment with that? This was a beautiful, beautiful experiment for us because a couple things. One, we would often bring up reports, like the person that tracked it would come in and go, okay, over the last year, here's a pie chart of like the extra beyond the bills and what you put into projects at your own home and what you put into loving of neighbors. Is this what you want the pie chart to look like? Like, are you erring one way or another? And we would like wrestle with that over our values. Like, does our budget demonstrate it? But one of the things I noticed was when if you put the money on the table, let's say, and you said, so it's in my hand, it's my money. And then you put it on the table. Now it's our money. And you've already made that move. What was really powerful to me is just witnessing over the years how much holier the individuals became in the use of that money just naturally. So they didn't become holy like with their money, but they did act holy in their stewardship of our money. And that like really left an impression with me. Like there was something like once you'd already detached from the like mine ownership piece of it, you operated in much deeper kind of level of conviction with it. So anyway, I want to throw that out there because I thought like that was a really interesting, like, it's something you grow toward, but those testing pieces of it kind of like are a real argument for like, hey, maybe we should up the number, maybe we should like pool more if we're managing it well. And I just want to say one other thing is, Taylor said we would have just been a neighborhood association if we didn't have these convictions and these commitments spiritually. So we actually were a neighborhood association, but not the house. So what ended up happening was we saw, because we were in this poor neighborhood, this historic kind of black and brown community, and we started seeing gentrification in the neighborhoods around us and the effects of the neighborhood associations that formed, because they didn't look like the rest of the community. It was like the new people that came in would form these and start making all these decisions on behalf of the community. And so I went and looked up like our neighborhood, which was called Ybor Heights. And there was a neighborhood, but there was no association. There hadn't been in like 20 years or something. And so because one of our commitments was to the neighborhood, we were like, we need to get that before anyone else does. And we need to like get it into the hands of the neighbors who are already here, because these guys are coming. They're coming and they're going to take this thing over. And so it's interesting when you said that, it just stood out to me. I was like, oh, we actually did form the neighborhood association. But it was really in some like squatter position so that we could like, I could walk in as like the city's like, oh, there's this white guy that moved into the neighborhood and we're going to like, there's a new one starting like the neighborhood next door. But then like, I got like the welcome that they got, that those other people got as far as the city was concerned. But then I was able to go back to our neighbors and be like, okay, like, but it's yours. Right. And so now it never was easy to get people to gather for those meetings. The dinners were way better. And we didn't couple them, but anyway, there's plenty of like overlap, and I love hearing this like story, and super jealous of the longevity of it, because I do think like so much of my life today I recognize is somewhat nostalgic. Like I tasted a thing that was like all I've ever wanted, But over time, people grew up and started families and got jobs or had to move away. And like, it like dispersed over time. There was never like a big breakdown. It was just life. Like,
When we and then go when we say this all the time, the idea of brave cities. Why is
Courage.
brave such a significant word in the kingdom ecosystem narrative? And it is, Joel said it earlier, but we are in a constant war against a principality and a power that is pulling us into comfort and ease. And
yep.
I would almost say like pseudo what's the word I'm looking for, guys? Like a false sense of security.
Yeah.
And I always think of the scene in The Matrix when the guy is sitting with the officials, the men in black, and he's saying, "Look, I know this steak that I'm eating isn't real.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Put me
I
back.
don't care anymore. I'm tired of living in the Matrix, or I'm tired of living outside of the Matrix. I'm tired of every day having to fight. And I want to be back in this." And so I do think it takes an exceptional amount of courage on all of our parts to go, do I really believe this again today?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the spiritual
Yeah.
disciplines come in.
Yes, this was going to be the connection that I made between, kind of as I'm hearing your story, John, like another version of this kind of story, something's rising up in me, and I think this is some of the bridge to these spiritual practices. Is the Sermon on the Mount's impossible, like we're using this language of like moving toward it or making these hard choices, because that's kind of the point of the Sermon on the Mount, is like no one can do this, like
Right.
it's and I think even as
Even the disciples say something like this, what you're talking about.
That's right.
Awesome.
And even as I'm hearing, our really feeble attempts to live this out, I'm thinking about, okay, we've taken steps toward the common purse. On one hand, there's been so much joy in that. On the other hand, I think I suck at it. It's like, I don't think I've accomplished this, and this is where I think there's a kind of like, Taylor, I've heard you say before, life around the poor will create a kind of prayer life in you. You'll end up fasting.
You have to pray.
Yeah, because it's so impossible. Well, I feel that same way with this kind of life and community. It is so impossible, that I think what it ought to create in us, there are these moments of joy and like, wow, there's joy in life in the kingdom and freedom from empire and all that kind of stuff. But also, I think this kind of desperation of God. So these older guys, more recently, I've pretty much been joining them 3 times a day for prayer.
Yep.
Which, as much as I've been around them, I haven't been as regular as I've been recently, but I think it's because I've been in a more desperate place for a number of reasons. Mm-hmm. And one thing I love is every evening, on one hand, we sing or say, pretty much every evening, we sing or say the Song of Simeon. Like, my eyes have seen, and there's a testimony of joy there. It's like, no, we're not just waiting for the future king. My eyes have seen something, so I can go in peace, and there's that acknowledgement. But then every night we pray, Lord, we have failed you, failed each other, failed the world you have created, and part of their liturgy is, we have sinned by things we've done, things we've left undone, and people have sinned on our behalf. That's a humble admission of like,
yep.
Hey, empire is still sinning on our behalf in some ways, yep. By the way we spend our money and time.
Yeah, we've empowered empire.
Yes. And honestly, for me, I love that we pray that every day, that's like, God, we still don't have it. And I don't hear in them this beating themselves about it. It's this settledness. It's this peace of
if you don't have that, people would tear each other apart with judgment.
That's right. Because you would set up some false standard, like I'm reaching the Sermon on the Mount because I'm doing X, Y, and Z, and you're not, And there's just a humility in that creates room for us to keep leaning into some things. But I've noticed with celebration, it's not like, oh, let's pray so that God does something. It's this prayer that's like, we're just desperate for God. Like,
Can I is this whole time I'm thinking like the practical season that we're in right now of after 7 years, adding some gathering options for people that have leaned in, almost like if you picture somebody being inspired by a Benedictine order and they go, I'm thinking about joining. And so we might have for the first time, you know, a room at a certain part of the week where there's kind of people checking out, do they want to commit to our way of life? And if we didn't like revisit this right now, we would potentially set up another consumer option for people. I think the power of thinking through either written or just intuitive covenants, it's about discipleship and about what you're asking people to like. So I picture at some point people coming into a gathered spot with us who they're not sure you know, this is their thing. And I feel like we're going to have to say every time we're together in that, like, what this is and what we're committed to. Like, it's almost got to be a mantra in our liturgy of this side door gathering it's for these purposes, like that. And we literally would say there is a common purse here, like 100% of our collected money. It doesn't have to go to anything. It doesn't have to go to a staff. It doesn't have to go to, so, but I think if we don't invite people into the covenants, then we're no different than any other sort of church environment where people can just come and suck or consume. So I feel like these covenants are really critical. Like,
well, it's also really helpful. Like, I mean, anything you're going to do with someone else, let's say we're going to renovate a kitchen, right? Like, we probably need to like have an idea of what the layout of the kitchen is going to be. We need to have a plan together. It's just some basic, like, what tile are we using on the backsplash? Like, and I actually do think just the articulation of agreement is really important, because what that helps the ward against is expectations of one another that aren't actually commitments. Like, I expect you to be good with the stranger coming in. It's like, no. In this house, we welcome the stranger, and we're all on the same page. We've already talked about it. Like, I'm not presuming something, or because all of that leads to it's like, 12 steps always say, like, expectation is premeditated resentment. It's like you're going to resent one another when you have expectations of one another that you did not agree to. And so I actually think, just like the choosing the tile on the backsplash, it's just a way to go, we're not going to fist fight over the tile cutter when it comes down to the work.
Historically, monastic communities had kind of an onion layer, to these covenants, so it wasn't all or nothing. Kind of the outer edge is just the stranger they might take into the monastery.
And what's the word for that person that's like the friend of the obliate? Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Where it's like yeah. I've even been looking at a Benedictine community where I'm like, I might become an obliate there, where it's like you live elsewhere, but you come for.
Yeah. And then there's like novitiates who are kind of exploring the covenant, but haven't fully committed. Now, in the traditional orders, that stuff is pretty, even Benedictine's own, St. Benedict's own rule, lays out.
It's set up. That's right.
Yeah. But celebration, like, we've watched them, like this community we're with in Aliquippa, we've watched them adapt that for their own purposes. So they call it companions. It's like people who are drawn to their way of life, but don't want to commit, to this, but they make room for them, to participate in some ways. And then they kind of had layers of commitment going in. And one word that they've given us over the years, just so that, because, you start talking about community, and I think we were talking about Bonhoeffer's wish dream, language surrounding community. It's real easy to have really idealized versions in our minds of what community is, but they've made it clear that over the years there were people who were drawn to something in their community, but it just was not going to work, like, or this person would actually be damaging to the community. And they had ways of still relating to those hard people without bringing them into the center of everything where they could do a ton of damage to their relationships, you know? And so we've benefited from that wisdom as well.
You mentioned Bonhoeffer. Because I had this pulled up in front of me under the section. So one of our things was gratitude in that covenant we had. And we have this quote from Bonhoeffer's Life Together in there under gratitude. And I just want to share it. What inexhaustible riches must invariably open to those who by God's will are privileged to live in daily community life with other Christians. Of course, what is an inexpressible blessing from God for the lonely individual is easily disregarded and trampled underfoot by those who receive the gift every day.
Yeah, that is true.
And, you know, it's funny reading that today where that was so clearly held in front of us when we were in it. But I wonder now that I'm not, you know, did I have an appropriate posture of gratitude? Because right now I have a very deep appreciation for what was.
Yeah.
Right. And like the longing for that is deep because it's like, yeah, there's something super rich and sacred about that shared life. But when you're in it, it is hard to have a proper posture of gratitude. Even if you have deep gratitude, it's like later I'm like, man, that wasn't proper gratitude.
It's hard to have the posture because it really can be hard. Like even in the practical things, I've told people living in the row houses, you know, that we live in, they're these old, all built in like 1916, 3-story, 4-bedroom, and just go straight up. You just have to constantly negotiate space, you know, when you live in that kind of proximity with each other. You can't do much without thinking about.
There's a lot of common space, but very little private
Yes,
space.
and so everything you're negotiating space, and that requires a certain kind of self-denial that any meaningful relationship requires, you know. But I think you're right. I think the temptation is to lose the posture of gratitude in the midst and to always think about what this is costing me instead of what I'm being blessed with.
Yeah.
I think we've often described ourselves, probably a little tongue in cheek, as treasure hunters. We somewhere along the way got a glimpse of the treasure in the field. We smelled it or we saw it out of the corner of our eye, and our lives have now been marked as these kind of wild-eyed experimenters trying to find it. And I think, if anything, that's what will mark us. It won't be a specific monastic way. There are some monastic ways that I think a lot of people in this stream tend to be drawn to. It won't necessarily be even a historical way of life, a guy like Bonhoeffer, but it will be this obsessive pursuit of the kingdom way and experimenting ways to do that. I'll share one example. My family has gotten into property development and property management on a very small scale, and mostly lower income areas. And the other day when I was sick, I had the flu over Christmas and just laid in bed in misery, thinking of my 2024. And all I could really think of in this one kind of block was the 40 different people that Lindsay and I have walked with that have either lived or connected to people who have lived in some of these properties that we own. And we've walked through loss with them. We've walked through homelessness with them. We've walked through loneliness. I told some of our community about Tony over Christmas, who's a disabled man. He can't walk. He's in a wheelchair. He lives in one of our units, and we were visiting with him one night, just talking through some things, and he was just expressing how Christmas is really hard for him because he has no connection to his family and he's all alone. And so we were gone. So we reached out to our faith community here And we said, hey, would anybody be willing to go spend some time with Tony? And two families said, yeah, we got him. And they made meals and went and sat with him. And he called Lindsay crying one night and said, this is the best Christmas he'd had in years. And the reason I share that story is to say we could all share these individual accounts of experimentation of we're just trying to find the treasure in the field. And it's so much more fun to do it in community than to do it alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we had in our weekly gathering, what was the alternative to Christmas in the Costanza family? You guys remember? Festivus.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So if you don't remember, in the Seinfeld show, there was this Costanza family had what they called Festivus. And instead of the exchanging of gifts, they did what they called the airing of grievances, which is amazing. And so we literally had in our house meeting, our weekly house meeting, like agenda, because we had to go over the finance and the chores and like prayer. Like we had all these things we were definitely going to do while we were together. They were long meetings. We had Festivus every week. We had a time to go, hey dude, you really pissed me off this week, or you left all those dishes in the sink, whatever it is. Right. And because so much of what we're sharing is, I don't know, like there's like this rich appreciation for the life together. And there's like the implication of, oh, it's hard sometimes. But I wanted to kind of ask, like, to maybe Joel, I know, like, through whether it's your own experience in this community or stories from the Long community, because they were together over so long, or even your time with them. I just want to like double click on the idea of like conflict, both in the communication of like, just like in any marriage, right? Like hey, we're living in close proximity. We're going to have some issues. We're going to have to talk some things out, fight some things out. And then sometimes those rifts are huge and sometimes even lead to something like you mentioned, like an exodus or something like that. Like we've all like had these experiences. I just think for those listening that are like, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture, because it's a both and kind of scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me speak about the older community and celebration.
Yep.
I mean, in Aliquippa first, their name is the community celebration. I think one thing that drew me to them in the early years with it is that they did not have a romanticized version of community. As a matter of fact, one of the earliest things I learned about them, and I'm not going to share like that, it's their story and the details of their story here, but they went through a number of painful periods, but one very painful one actually after they arrived in Aliquippa. At the time I met them, maybe they were 8 or 10 years removed from that really difficult period. And I saw something in them. If I were just to sum it up, I would say they still believed in this, that they still believed in that living in community was worth it. And that was inspiring to me, even though I knew they had a lot of pain. And secondly, I saw gratitude and contentment and not bitterness. I think I've met people who stayed in community, but you wonder why, because they just hate it, and like hate everyone. But I saw
marriages like that.
At least are really pretending well that they
that's right. So I saw a genuine gratitude and content, even toward the people who had really hurt them, and even left them. And a realism about each other. Like they understood each other's quirks, failings. They can even complain about each other sometimes in a way that I find healthy, like, oh, I can't stand it. He always does that. You'll hear these little comments from them, they've had their own ways of, like you said, kind of the keeping short accounts. They've had their own practices of that over the years, spaces to talk things out. However, it's interesting. They're part of the Episcopal Church, and so they've inherited some wisdom, I would say, about monastic life. And one of those things is that they have a bishop visitor, which in itself is really interesting because it means that their authority isn't under the bishop of their geography. So it gives them freedom to do some like radical things, but they do have an outside voice that they all submit themselves to. And the reason I'm pointing this up, there's probably a number of ways to figure that out, for different communities. But the reason I point it out is they actually have an outside mediator set up.
Mm-hmm.
That the assumption is that significant conflict is going to happen in this community, and that they have a resource to access when that time comes. It's like they don't just sit there and hope it doesn't happen. They're set up for it. So they've had times in their community life where not only did they have to access that resource, but that person had to bring in other resources, to help them. The conflicts were so significant. So they've just reassured us over the years as we've had our own conflicts. We've had some recently, as they've reassured us over the years that this is part of it. This is normal. And every community has skeletons in their closet, that are actually part of their story. And that reality actually needs to be embraced,
So in light of this conversation, do you think it was maybe ill-timed or inappropriate for me just to suggest that you shut her down? Shut it down.
Instead of sticking with it,
working it through.
But you know what? I think life and community, I mean, we're laughing about this, but I think, and you were saying this at the beginning, I think life and community does reach these points where we've got to choose it out of our own freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we will feel victimized by it, And I think it's okay to hit these crossroads as individuals, as a community, where it's like, am I actually freely choosing this or not? And to live with the consequences of that as a free human being.
That's right.
One way or another. Because I think that's part of the equation of joy. It's like I chose it. No one did this to me. I chose it.
Should we call this one Life Together? ?
Probably 2 question marks.
Got it.
Good. Thanks for that's pretty good. Just like when we didn't know what we were going to talk about, but you're talking from your actual life, and we appreciate you showing up.
Oh, guys, thank you.
So awesome.
Yeah, this is a good topic, man. It's something I'm thinking about a lot too. Like, just I hung out with a few of the guys from the house from back in the day the other night, and it was like beautiful to be together, and it also just like, damn it. I miss y'all. You just want to like come back, drop your stuff, and like give this another go. They're too far gone. They got life and they live in other places, and they're rooted in other stuff now.
Strange how life gets in the way, and or something. Circumstances change, and you this way of life has really marked my entire journey. For people who know my whole journey, my last 2 years of high school was an intense covenant community of young people, really centered around prayer and mission. My 4 years in undergrad was just remarkable, of covenant and faith and mission and radical living. And it's just kind of marked every season. The one season that is posed significant kind of how do we do this now is right now with the 5 kids and being pulled in every different direction. And I feel like we're figuring it out. We're doing it. But we're more kind of going, right now we are more saying to our kids, we're with y'all. Like we're kind of partnering with you.
Yep.
While Hugh and I think, and a few others are trying to establish something really special here in Alton too. So never stop experimenting.
Kind of, it just adds some a little hopeful thing for that with this particular community. One of their community members passed away in the last couple years, and her memorial service was this last summer. About 70 people came back to the property. All right. And the day after the memorial, and music has always been a big part of this community. So it was beautiful, like the worship and all that. The day after, I walk into the common area that's on the property outside of the chapel, where they have the kitchen and everything. And there's a bunch of them hanging out there. And just to give you the picture, these are all people in their 70s and 80s. I don't think anyone was younger than 70. And they all intersected life with this community over the span of these decades, but most of them are not there. Some of them left during very painful times of the community's existence. And it was like they were all in college. Like food is spread out everywhere. One of them has a guitar. And then they just start singing together and sharing songs.
Yeah.
And I got my phone out and like secretly recorded them for like an hour. And on one hand, you could feel the grief in the room. Like, man, we've lost something. And maybe we always lose something on this side of glory, but it's like they were something real there to celebrate. I mean, they were crying together, sharing stories, all the funny things that happened. They hung out with Desmond Tutu once. They're sharing that story, like all these things they saw God do. And I thought to myself, you know what? If that's what it's like when I'm 70 and 80, even with all the loss, and
it'll be good.
It'll be good.